Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Woo! I really look forward to Fridays now, like even more than I used to. Not just because it's Friday and it's before the weekend. I mean, because when you're an entrepreneur, like the days of the week sort of don't really mean anything at all. You just do what you got to do when you got to do it, when you want to do it, and all those types of things, the benefits of being a naturepreneur. But this, the ability to come here and spend an hour of my day with you in this format, I really love. I was actually preparing up all the various different papers. I started to go through another batch of papers I go through the papers from date ranges. So I started to go through a specific date range in order to kind of queue them up. And oh, I get so excited. It's hard not to actually get in there and start to read them. But I want to read them here with you. So I try really hard to not read them. So hopefully you're all doing well. It's been a wonderful week. Well, it's been a powerful week. Let's say it that way. With the end of the commemoration of the dead ritual, as well as the Dia de los Muertos and Halloween, it's just been intense. Everything's kind of there on the surface, and you can feel it. At least I can feel it. Hopefully you can feel it. Anyway, today we are doing a paper that I thought we were going to be able to do last week, except for last week's article. Woo, machine minds. That really took me for a tizzy. And I have to say that since then, I have been thinking so much about that paper. That article. I've been thinking about lots of the considerations, not just the plant considerations, especially that one phrase around plants, the one of like, it's like about plants. It's like if AI is even perceived to be conscious, then we can't use it for fear of torturing. They literally use the word torturing potentially sentient beings. And I was like, oh no, for having potentially sentient beings suffer. That was the phrase. It was suffering. And I was sitting there going, huh? Like what we do to plants all the time. I mean, we know they feel, we know that they're sentient and they're aware, we know that they're intelligent, and yet we have no qualms with you. So that article really got me thinking about that whole topic and how do we use this discussion to further our discussion around plant intelligence and further proving my point of the amount of fear that we have, because we're not reliant on AI right now, but when we will be, this will be a very difficult topic to have, just the same as we are reliant on plants right now, and therefore this is an extremely difficult topic to have. So today, in continuation of that conversation around conscious AI and conscious plants and what that all means, this is a paper called In Defense of Plant Personhood. It is a paper by Matthew Hall. And you've heard me talk about Matthew Hall a few times before, because Matthew Hall is another one of those influential figures in this. So Matthew Hall is he is the Associate Director of Research Services at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. And he's the author of the book Plants as Persons, which is a philosophical botany. He is basically originally trained as a botanist, but then Matthew Hall kind of really has moved into the realm of being a philosopher in these areas of specialization around plants, plant intelligence, plant consciousness, all these different topics. And his work really more than anything looks to understand the relationships between beings and plants, human beings and plants. So really looking at how is it that plants and human beings interact, what is their relationship like, what are their interpersonal skills like, all these different aspects of it. And I find him to be another one of those really fascinating person. I think that the realm of philosophy really just does open us to being able to at least conceptualize some of these discussions that later on will, I think, become much more poignant as they enter into the various realms of sciences and social sciences connected to them. So, but anyways, let me share my screen. Let's get into this. because it's kind of, as always, none of these are short. It's not super long though, so we should be able to get through it today. All right, so this was published in Religions of all places, Religions. So this is an article. Again, it's not, remember when we're talking about papers of all sorts, we're talking about articles, which are more like, discussions based on the research. We're talking about actual studies that have been carried out. And so this is an article. It was put out in March of 2019. And pretty much everything that I have queued up for the next foreseeable future is really in the range of 2016 to 2020. I do have some amazing things I have found in 2023, 2022, and 2023, but we're just going to have to take it one step at a time because there is so much. And also, I'd love to hear from you. If you're listening on the replay, please put this in the comments or in the chat. And if you're here with us live, I am trying to understand, there are a few very kind of experimental science papers that I think I'm going to interweave. I'm going to mix those in because they help us better understand how plants communicate using, and how, in other words, it gives the foundation upon which many of these authors and scholars are talking about plant intelligence and plant personhood and plant stuff based on how plants act biologically. So I do think that every once in a while, and you tell me if you do want to see this, I mean, you might not want to see it at all, and tell me that too, of whether or not you want to actually hear about some of these more biological papers, if I can get them to be within the context of how is it that these papers either help us or prove or disprove the idea that plants are sentient and plants are communicating. So I have a few of those queued up and ready to go. And I'm just kind of, because I think that they're important. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I feel like it's important to be able to have this conversation. Okay, so let's kind of, I don't want to make this 200%. I want to make this like 160, no? Yeah, there we go. Okay, a little bit bigger. So again, this was originally received in March of 2019, but it was published in May of 2019. And let's just dive into it because it's not that long, but you know how I am. You know how I get. Anyway. Here's the abstract. The philosopher Michael Marder has asserted that animistic engagement with plants involves a projection of human purposes and goals leading to veneration. Alrighty, what a charged sentence. Animistic engagement with plants involves a projection of human purposes and goals leading to veneration. This is Marder's assessment, and not only Marder's, I heard this recently it was an interview with, who was it? It was Michael Marder and Giovanni Alawi, who were talking about the idea that we have to be careful because some are going on the fact of like, almost as if plants are omnipotent and always very altruistic. And so Michael Marder is trying to caution to say, let's look at the natural world kind of with a more realistic lens, which is to say, wars do happen wars, it's a bad connotation of words, but in other words, there are battles happening inside of a forest. There are plants that are going to cover up others. There are those parasites that are going to kill their host. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that not everything that's happening is like, oh, kumbaya and sunshine and mutually beneficial relationships, right? We do have predation, we do have parasitism, and it's important to recognize the role and the function of those. I think what has been different, and I do agree that there's lots of people that are like venerating, like they're just sitting there under trees going and plants, and you're amazing, and you're the most fantastic things ever. And while I, of course, do love plants, I think we do have to be realistic in our understanding that, plants are organisms that, that have their own agendas too. And where I think the difference that I'm starting to get to is the idea that autism, as we know it, does with plants in the same way that it exists with humans. But this is part of the discovery that we're going to have as we get deeper into these conversations on plant consciousness. As conscious beings, is that light and darkness, can it be both of them being from a place of even selfishness, but not ego, or does ego attach somewhere automatically? I don't know. This is a good question. Anyway, he has also argued that an extension of a categorical concept of personhood underpins my previous work on plant personhood. Remember, Matthew Hall has written a whole book on plant personhood, and Marder has talked extensively about this topic. This paper draws on the growing scholarship of animist traditions following the work of Hallowell to reject Marder's characterization of a naive animist approach to plants. It draws on these insights from animist traditions to outline a relational plant personhood, which is fully realized only in grounded, situated relationships of care that seek to enable the flourishing of plants. So this is going to be interesting because I think that, again, it is very easy as plant lovers for us to go down the path of all plants are good, everything that they do is fantastic. The idea of grounding, once we start to recognize them as persons, right, which have both roles and responsibilities, then it's where the character starts to come out. So it is important for us to recognize and look at plants from a kind of general holistic view of looking at them for who they are as they are rather than who we want them to be. The geographer Puleo, which we also reviewed his paper, you can find it in the replays, has recently chartered the ever-increasing body of research into plant subjectivities. Why do they have to use such big words? Subjectivities, agency. Yeah, okay, I get it. It's hard. Plants as subjects. Starting his journey with Michael Pollan's The Botany of Desire on our list of potential books that we could choose from for the Plant Wisdom Book Club. Hasn't come up yet, but it is a good book. I've read it. It's a very good book. Puleo navigates through the work of Stefano Mancuso, my professor, a pioneer of plant neurobiology, name checks this author's work on plant personhood, and explores Michael Marder's vegetal ontology alongside Jeffrey Nealon's work on plant theory. I don't know Jeffrey Nealon very well. I need to go read his work. Of particular interest to this author and to this special issue on religions and plants is Marder's criticism of the concept of plant personhood. Oh, I remember this. This is because Marder thinks that personhood is actually below a plant. Like almost saying plants are beyond that. They're just a different organism and therefore personhood. You remember this conversation? We had this. You can go back through when we went through some of Marder's work, you can see, and Puleo's work, you can see this conversation of like, maybe we're thinking of plants as too banal like humans are. I remember this. This is interesting. In a discussion, plants as subjects, Puleo cites Marder's assertion in his Plant Thinking that in attributing concept of autonomy or personhood to plants, philosophers render more refined the violence human thought has never seen. Wait a minute, hold on. That in attributing concepts of autonomy or personhood to plants, philosophers render more refined the violence human thought has never ceased unleashing against these beings, and connects this with another rejection of the concept of personhood by the plant biologist Daniel Chamovitz. Chamovitz is the one who's written the book on plant senses, What a Plant Knows, and he completely categorically absolutely rejects the idea that plants can be sentient beings, have any consciousness, any of those types of things. He's one on that side. He's very practical in his mind. I don't know what he really is, but that's what I think he would call himself. Puleo dips his toe into an analysis of competing depictions of plant life, contrasting the idea of plant personhood with Marder's attempt to emphasize the radical alterity of plant being. He presented Marder's view of plant ontology as so radically different from that of humans that words such as persons, subjectivity, and self cannot be applied. Indeed, to call a person a plant is an insult. You'll go back Go back through our previous papers and you will find this paper by Puleo where he talks about this. This is a good one where it was at first like, what are you talking about? It's an insult. And then when you read through the paper, it makes it more clear. So this is the entire crux of the discussion today, is this challenge that is it an insult, or why is it that Hall will now defend why he thinks that this is that it is a good terminology and what we should use. A view on plant ontology in which you can insult a plant by calling it a person stems from Marder's philosophy of plant thinking. According to Marder, plant thinking starts with the explosion of identity. That is, following Derrida's deconstruction of the animal, plants are regarded as multiplicitous assemblages, modularly composed of parts capable of independent rejuvenation. The plant is not a differentiated organism, but a collection of many. Therefore, if the plant is not an organism consisting of interdependent organs, we should avoid conceiving it as a totality or as a differentiating whole. And I think that this is a really interesting concept, okay? Think about it. If you can propagate a plant, if you could take a piece of a plant, that piece of the plant into dirt and create a new plant, is that plant that you just planted, gosh, see why we need vocabularies? Anyways, is this other plant the same plant? Or once that plant starts to have its own experiences, he becomes an individual. Now, the question is, if a plant, especially a tree that is growing large, let's take a tree because it's an easy example, but grass is a fantastic example of this. At what point is grass one entity? Is it each individual frond, like each individual piece of grass, or what? So the comment by Marder is that, and by Puleo also, is the idea that it's an insult because we're limiting the we would think of it as multipotentialite in some ways, right? The multiple organism that a plant really is. So by trying to call that plant one entity, you're sort of restricting it. This assertion of non-identity is intimately connected with a lack of, with a lack of interiority presented as such, both because plants do not, on the whole, consume other organisms, but also because plants, as generally sessile, are rooted in place and, according to Marder, completely open to their environment, a sheer exposure in space and time. Therefore, for Marder, given that the plant's self, bound to the universality of the elements and of light, is always external to itself, its unity is at once a disunity. Powerful words, right? Really, really gets you to thinking. For Marder, the clearest symptom of this non-identity of the plant is its unrest, a restless intentional growth and plasticity, a ceaseless striving towards the other and becoming other in growth. So a ceaseless striving towards other and towards the other and becoming other, right? Remember, this is that concept of evolution where when we look at evolution from a human or many animals, evolution is very slow going, right? It's not even easy to see what is considered an evolution within one life. When it comes to plants, it's pretty fast, right? You're almost always becoming something else. So ceaseless striving towards the other and becoming other in growth and reproduction, as well as in the metamorphosis of these vegetal qualities into human and animal potentialities. Marder connects the ceaseless growth and ontological openness with a generosity of plant life. Therefore, to attribute a static identity is to disregard this vivacity. Indeed, to pay heed to a vegetal non-entity is to also acknowledge vegetal ontological indifference, which exemplifies through the selflessly throwing away its pollen, fruit, and seeds. The acknowledged ontic material facts of plants possessing self-defense, mechanisms do not deter this argument. So the idea that a plant is very selfless in nature, right? Throwing away its pollen, like really looking at, and notwithstanding the fact that the plant defends itself, does not mean that the plant is not, though, still selfless in its ability to give in that way. Marder's deconstruction of plant ontology renders the plant as an autonomous, selfless, non-identity, indifferent, and non-organism. I'm going to say that sentence again. Marder's deconstruction of plant ontology renders the plant as a non-autonomous, selfless, non-identity, indifferent, non-organism. I will argue directly against these claims in a later paper. Here, I wish to focus on his dismissal of personhood. To do so, I wish to highlight two further claims by Marder. The first of these arises in his discussion on the fetishism of plants in his book, Plant Thinking. Here, Marder rejects what he called animist mentalities, which find something inexplicable and miraculous in the plant and therefore treat it as a worthy veneration, whose myths are found to be paving the way for projection of human purpose and goals onto it. Dang, man, that's heavy. The second claim, published in a journal article titled, "Is it ethical to eat plants?" is worth quoting. The problematic assumption that the concept of personhood can be extended to plants undermines Matthew Hall's recent book, Plants as Persons, A Philosophical Botany. There are, in fact, three subclaims here. That my book, Plants as Persons, assumes that a categorical personhood can be extended to plants, that this underpins the work, and that such an idea is problematic. Marder does not expand on the latter claim, but from the treatment of plant fetishism, I assume that he regarded personhood as a human-centered projection based on an obfuscation, sublimation, or eradication of a plant's nature. This, also presumably, is at the heart of the alleged violence toward plants that Puleo charts. Now, the purpose of this article is to reject Marder's claim about the animistic understandings of plants and the concepts of plant personhood, as it appears in my previous work. Such endeavors are interlinked, as in Plants as Persons. I draw deeply on the concepts of personhood found in animist cultures, with a simple purpose. The structure of this article will also be fairly straightforward. I will very briefly sketch out the broad categories of personhood and as they've been employed by Western philosophers to help situate the animistic personhood that Marder both mischaracterizes and with which he takes offense. I will explore the work of leading scholars in the study of animism to understand how relational personhood works before outlining how such ideas have shaped my own notion of plant personhood. We will close with a brief discussion of how relationships and care that personhood requires can be effected without recourse to philosophical violence. You know how they have like a dance-off, right? The dance-off where you have people who like one dances and then like throws it down, the other one dances. This is the equivalent. This is philosophical like dance-offs. They're going to do a little dance. So Marder has on Hall's work, and now Hall is going to on Marder's work. I'm not sure I see the benefit in explaining how your work has been misinterpreted. I just hope he does it in a way that's uplifting, right? And I have a feeling that he can do it. I'm just curious as to how he's planning this to be. Hold on a second. I need to check in. I just realized that sometimes people, when we did Puleo's work, when we reviewed his, I'm trying to find this one because it was a really interesting, and I want to make sure that I tell you where to look for it. Forget it. I'll have to go looking for it in another moment because I don't want to waste our time. Okay, we're going to keep going. Approaches to personhood. First, it will be useful to outline the general landscape with regards to the concept of personhood. Even the briefest of dips into the literature illustrates that there are a myriad of claims to the concept. Thankfully, there is also plenty of existing scholarship that can provide an overarching view of how the concept has been deployed. without copious details distracting us from the central purpose. Here, I will draw on the recent work of Forster and Herring, which provides a broad categorization of the existing theories of personhood and will fill a couple of noticeable gaps with Takeman, older, and more detailed accounts of the definition of a person. Forster and Herring outline two general approaches to the definition of a person. The first of these is a person as a member of the human species. Obviously not applicable in this case. In the language of Gali, this is the archetypal exemplar of personhood from which all other uses derive, in Western scholarship at least. Certainly, the common language use of the word person is synonymous with human being, as a fact exemplified by one of the Oxford English Dictionary definitions of person as an individual human being, man, woman, or child. The definition has been defended as a natural bias in favor of human beings, but has also been criticized by animal rights theorists and activists as a form of speciesism. For Forster and Herring, such criticism is found on the argument that membership of a species is not morally relevant and should not confer moral status. The second broad category is where much of this contemporary action is. The category designates person as those with certain mental capabilities. The obvious conflict is over which capabilities are deemed morally relevant, with major candidates including consciousness, self-interest, cognition, rationality, and self-awareness. In the case of plants, right, we have consciousness, debated, self-interest, pretty agreed upon, cognition, in current understanding based on, the work of the whole plant cognition movement. So there is a much deeper understanding and pretty much agreement that there is cognition. Rationality, which would be, for me, decision-making, another one that is probably on the same scale as cognition, not as far away as consciousness, but definitely on the scale of like pretty understood and accepted, but still there's a few outliers. Self-awareness, I think everybody agrees with. So if those are the major candidates, I think we're on good moral standing. And who exactly possesses these capabilities? An influential example from the philosophical literature is provided by Locke's definition of a person as a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself. Oh, I would say that plants fit into that one pretty easily. I mean, I think that considering themselves, and not an it, but considering themselves as themselves is probably still being debated. But I can understand. This privileging of reason and self-consciousness is also found in numerous theological explications of person and has persisted within Western philosophical thinking to the modern day. Historically, both of these categories have almost entirely overlapped on the concept of human being equals person, but have underpinned the legal sense of the concept of person as based on the notion of juridical rights. However, as an essentially contested concept, true, the boundaries of personhood are not fixed. Most notably, the boundaries of the mental capacities category have been widened by animal theorists arguing for personhood on the basis of capacities of non-human animals. There are numerous examples of this, including the capacities of non-human animals for intelligence, self-interest, and communication, which again, plants have all three. Scholars have also more corporeal considerations of personhood, including sentience, emotional capacity, and the ability to suffer or feel pain. Now, I'm sure he's going to go into this, but the concept of feel pain and suffering seems to be, in all the literature I've been reading, linked, in the sense that to feel pain is to suffer. This was something that we discovered last week in the Minds of Machines article that we went through, where they were talking about the idea that if the machine becomes conscious and feels pain, that means that they will suffer. But not all pain is suffering. And I think that this is going to be an extremely important capacity that we need to unhinge or to disconnect from one another if we're going to open up the discussion of plants wider. Because if it is not a given that because a plant feels the pain or feels what's happening to them, that necessarily equates to suffering. It doesn't mean it doesn't, but we don't know. And if we keep fixing these two together, then we don't get to the real core of what we need to understand, which is that if they feel it, they should have a choice as to whether or not they should endure it. I hope that made sense. It makes sense in my mind. This has been criticized by some scholars, most notably Plumwood, for being an extension of an essentially human category to non-human others based on traits they share with humans. See, that's what I was talking about. In recent years, such extensions have led to attempts to grant juridical personhood to non-human animals with varying degrees of success. Even more recently, Puleo has taken this approach with plant personhood, attributing to plants all of his 6 predetermined characteristics of personhood: agency, sentience, perception, consciousness, communicability, and contractibility. Oh, that's right, that we got caught up on the whole contractibility. How does a plant contract? I remember this discussion. How does a plant enter into a contract? Is what is happening with other plants, for example, or with a herbivore, is that a contract? Have they entered into a conscious contract? Are they able to enter into this contract? And if so, and if not, then does that mean that they're not a person, because a person should be able to contract? This is the reason why, for when we're talking about the rights of nature, we're still talking about a human interface that is able to then contract on behalf of, it's kind of more of a conservatorship than it is an actual like personhood being declared. Both of these broad approaches to personhood are essentially founded on the human being archetype. Marder's claim that plant personhood involves a human-centered projection onto plants would have some basis were such an approach to be employed. However, it is important to note that in my book, Plants as Persons, I rejected such approaches. Instead, I explore a broad concept of personhood based on relationship, which aligns better with Foster and Herring, relational approaches to personhood. For Foster and Herring, the basic relational nature of self means that the moral worth is not to be found in individual capacities or in membership of a species, but within relations. Which is what I was saying, right? If a plant, but well, we'll get there. That is, beings are not are conferred on moral status within the reciprocal nature of a relationship. For them, the problematizes. For them, this problematizes the question: is so and so a person? Because we can only conceive of moral status in the context of relationships and corporeal interaction, rather than on an intellectual calculation of mental capacities. I'm glad that there's more to this because there's a lot here to unpack. It is into this broadly relational approach to personhood that animistic cultures would most comfortably fit. To both reject Marder's claims of animistic mentalities projecting human purposes and goals, and to lay bare the foundations of my own approach to plant personhood, I wish to briefly outline a body of scholarship in anthropology and religious studies that has sought to reappraise the phenomenon of animism. Okay, so we're going to get into animistic. Catalyzed by the work of Irving Hallowell with the Ojibwa in the 1960s, there has been a concerted body of work in anthropology and religious studies to reappraise the term animism from Tyler's portrayal of animism as the deep-lying doctrine of spiritual beings, which I propose here under the name animism. The deep-lying doctrine of spiritual beings. Okay. Tyler took his term from the 17th century chemist and physician George Ernest Stahl and developed a theory of a belief in spirits based on a secondhand accounts of the lives of indigenous peoples regarded, as was common at the time, as primitive. Key to Tyler's view of animism was that such peoples held the concept of the soul, which was a thin, substantial human image, able to enter into, possess, and act in the bodies of other men, of animals, of even things. For Tyler, the nature of this soul in plants extended beyond the Aristotelian plant soul, conferring the capacity for growth, which is not unnaturally ascribed to become more fully identified within the soul of animals, conferring sentience and mind. Okay, wait, let me break this down. So, animism, according to Tyler, is deep-lying doctrine of spiritual beings. The idea that everything has spirit and that such peoples held a concept of a soul. So let's ignore the part of the human image for a second. So there's a soul able to enter into, possess, and act on the bodies. So this soul can enter into anything. So the nature of the soul in plants really expands beyond Aristotelian. So remember, Aristotelian is the scala naturae. So the idea that you have plants as basically just breathing beings there for our own benefit. They don't think, they don't really do anything other than just are alive in the most basic sense. So the idea is that if I convey that everything has a soul, then I expand on that definition and it's not just the idea of plants being on this ladder that goes from plants to animals to humans, but instead the idea that everything has this ability and this soul that connects everything. I think that's what I understood. Tyler's view of such a worldview is characterized throughout his work, primitive culture, as savage, crude, and backwards. Bird David points out that in holding such a view, the primitives were regarded as doubly mistaken about the existence of a ghost soul in humans and mistaken about the projection of the soul into non-human beings. The animist is thus like a child, projecting a false understanding of being, unable to tell the difference between the animate and the inanimate. Like Marder, Tyler connected this naive perception of a miraculous plant soul with a similarly naive veneration of the plants in question. For Tyler, the practice of tree worship involves notions more or less closely coinciding with that of tree souls. Okay. The Tylorian, love that. Tylorian view of animism, to which Marder closely aligns himself, is found on what Bird David calls modernist ontological dualisms, the dualisms explored by Plumwood, being at the heart of destructive Western separation from the natural world. Mind body, soul body, human nature, amongst others. As Stuckey neatly summarized, by defining animism as focused on the immaterial side of a material-immaterial split, okay, Tyler had firmly locked a Western epistemological frame onto perceptions of others' traditions. The obvious problem with such a view is that these animist traditions do not subscribe to these dualistic ontological categories. Okay, so basically you're saying that this whole way that we've just described, that Tyler, which is what Marder is saying when we're talking about, when he's thinking about plant personhood, he is using this definition that basically says that there's an animate and an inanimate, right? There's like a separation, a material and an immaterial. The idea that there is physicalness and spirit. And these things are very separate. So this is how the animism works, is by connecting into this spirit, or better yet, your spirit, like a human spirit, can go into any of these things. And that's the way I connect. So when I'm looking at a tree soul, it's kind of a projection of a little bit of a human soul type of aspect. Man, now I know why these guys study forever, all of them. The work of Irving Hallowell within the Ojibwa of the North American fundamentally challenged this ontological schism. Hallowell recognized the concept of a person that was not categorically identified with human beings as being central to the worldview of the Ojibwa. He also recognized that such a radical shift in perspective was required to present an accurate description of the way humans in the animistic society relate to the world around them. For Hallowell, the significance of these differences in perception may be illustrated in the case of an Ojibwa by the manner in which the kinship term grandfather is used. It is not only applied to human persons, but to spiritual beings who are persons of a category other than human. The person category does not begin with the human exemplar or archetype, which is what we were talking about before, right? It begins with this soul that is a little bit like a human projection of a soul. And so therefore, it's almost as if the tree, or whatever plant in this case, from Tyler's definition, is being inhabited by this layer that is human-like, and that where instead Hallowell is talking about the fact that no, what the Ajiba is trying to say is that human persons are one type of person, but spiritual beings who are persons out of a category other than nature can also be persons. And so we have to look at them not as connected by the same thing that makes them person, in the case of like a soul that's sort of human-like in nature, but instead each one of them has their own complete construction from beginning to end, which really does apply a lot to the Damanhurian philosophy, where when we talk about the mother worlds, right, we have the plant mother world and the human mother world, and the human is the animal world also, and the nature spirits mother world. Each one of them has their own kind of divine spark in there, and that divine spark is different. And as a matter of fact, the other day I was having a conversation with a Kabbalist Facebook chat thing where we were talking about it, and he was talking about sort of like the animist. He was also talking about it from a Kabbalistic perspective, which I wrote down because it's one of the areas I want to study more, because it's like all coming together, kind of this scientific view, which of course comes from an indigenous view, the Kabbalistic views that I have studied for years, and the Damanhurian views are also starting to come up with this idea of each one of us is a complete being, and our structures are all independent. They do things in completely different ways, but their ultimate function is the same, which is really what we look at when we look at biomimicry, for example, right? We're looking at nature's functions. How does nature move water, for example? And we're looking to mimic those functions, create equivalents that are human. They use human structures and human elements and are human, but at the same time, more closely represent what those what the functions and what they carry out, what the goals are of that. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is that what makes a human person is the structure of, you know, the attractor and the soul and the way the personalities fit into place. And plants have their own mechanics around this same thing, and who knows what it looks like, and that's what we're looking to discover. What does the plant soul, you could say, look like? What does the plant divine spark look like? What is that, and how does it, even though it carries out the same sort of functions that a human one does, but it does so in completely different ways? And I think this is what science is still getting stuck on, is that this is the whole argument we keep having about neurobiology, is that in plant neurobiology, we're trying to shove, we're using the definitions of human neurobiology and trying to understand that the plants don't do that. And it's like, yes, they do not do that thing in the way that those cells, those neurons, those electrical impulses fire, but they do carry out that same function in an anatomy that's completely different. And I think this is exactly the same argument that Hall is arguing too, is that it's a different anatomy, but the function is the same. The person category does not begin with the human exemplar or archetype. It is not a fundamentally human category. It is not a category based on an extension of the human. Instead, person is an overarching category of being. And that's it. That's exactly what I was just saying, much more succinctly here. For Detweiler, the category person applies to anything that has being or who is therefore capable of relating. This category includes subcategories of persons, including human and non-human. Hallowell's shorthand for these subcategories is other than human persons, a concept that has catalyzed the renewed scholarship of animistic traditions. Hallowell gave a number of concrete examples of such other than human persons in Ojibwa culture, including the sun, the wind, and rocks. Bird David noted that Hallowell's contribution to the study of animism was transformative, serving to free the study of animistic beliefs and practices from the modernist person concepts, and the notion that these were erroneous. Yet, she proposed in terms of superpersons, Bird Dave, rather than other, I like that, superpersons. I want to be a super person, rather than other than human persons, to avoid the possible implication that humanity is somehow definitive of personhood. However, however, has defended Hallowell's conception of personhood. Hallowell's phrase is rooted in the understanding of ontological similarity rather than difference, and does not assume that any particular kind of person is definitively ordinary. Implicitly, at least, it acknowledges the priority of close relationships over more distant ones. From a tree's point of view, there might be tree persons and other than tree persons, but Hallowell is a human addressing humans, so other than human remains useful. I like that. Tree might look at other than tree, so we are other than tree persons. I think I'm going to go with that. I'm going to start calling myself, rather than a human being, an other than tree person, or an other than grass. I want to be an other than grass person. Detweiler makes a similar point in his discussion of the Oglala Lakota people. Humans, or two-legged, are only one type of person. Humans share their world with Wakan and non-human persons, including human persons, stone persons, four-legged persons, winged persons, crawling persons, standing persons. Oh, plants and trees are standing persons. I'm good with that. Standing persons, fish persons, among other. Animists then are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. Contrary to Marder's assertions, their concern is not with projecting or worshiping some dualistic, miraculous, immaterial soul, either in plants, animals, or rocks, but relating to other persons, including non-humans, as proper persons. Like Foster and Herring, scholars of animism have argued that it is through this act of relating that beings are brought into personhood. Hallowell recounted a now famous story which helps to explain how this may work. Since stones are grammatically animate, I once asked an old man, "Are all the stones we see about us here alive?" He reflected for a long while and replied, "No, but some are." This qualified answer made a strong impression on Hallowell. He regarded the Ojibwa other than human person categories as not attributing living souls to inanimate objects such as stones, or to being part of a consciously formulated theory about the nature of stones. Rather, the Ojibwa recognize a priori potentialities for animism in certain classes of objects under certain circumstances. Honey, I actually think that we can say that there's the potential for being a person even in humans. Just saying. It's just I'm just gonna put that there. You might we're gonna put that there. The crucial test is experience. The Ojibwa's openness to the potentialities of the natural world keeps open the possibility for other than human persons that our modernist worldview can so easily close off. And isn't this actually kind of what Nadal said in Return of the Yggdrasil? Because even the aliens there, the Yggdrasil, didn't convey personhood to all plants. They didn't talk about all plants. Some plants, they didn't. They remember they were talking about trees, I think, beyond others. Makes me want to reread parts of that book. Drawing strongly on Hallowell's bird, David described the concept of personhood among the Nayaka, an indigenous people of India, in which a person is one who is in kinship relationship, not necessarily based on genealogy, mythology, or biology, but through the situated act of sharing and relating. Again, as for the Ojibwa, this is not a mental representation of the nature of beings that is applied to the world. The Nayaka constitute their own personhood by producing and reproducing, sharing relationships with surrounding beings, and as and when and because they engage in and maintain relationships with other beings. They constitute them as kinds of persons. They make them relatives by sharing with them and thus make them persons. The Nayaka work towards relating to other humans are attentive to mutual behaviors in these other beings. In the case of plants, bird echoed Kohaks, speaking with trees, presenting this as the epitome of Nayaka animistic epistemology. Talking is shorthand for a two-way responsive relatedness with a tree, rather than speaking one way to it. So talking is two-way and speaking is one. That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. That's the way I use those words. I hadn't thought about that. So interesting when you just kind of conceptualize something. As if it could listen and understand. Talking with stands for attentiveness to variances and invariances in behavior and responses of things in states of relatedness, and for getting to know such things as they change through the vicissitude. Today I'm having a hard time with words. Vicissitudes over time and of engagement with them. Unlike in our categorization above, Nayaka does not recognize a category of persons circumscribed by a certain set of priority mental capacities. This is an interesting one because it means that personhood is somewhat subjective, and I think that that's also dangerous. I think that we might have to explore that one because that might be a conversation for us to have in one of our chats, like where, like our iSpots grabber, this might be an interesting conversation piece, is like, if personhood is not just because I am a recognized category of something as like a stone or a plant or a winged or a four-legged. And so what is the stance of relating to other beings in the world is a foundation for knowing the world. Bird David's revisitation of animism stresses this relational epistemology, one in which knowing grows from and is maintaining relatedness with neighboring others. It involves individuating the environment rather than dichotomizing it, and turning attention to we-ness, which absorbs differences rather than to otherness, which highlights differences and eclipses commonalities. Against I think, therefore I am stand I relate, therefore I am, and I know as I relate. This really, to me, opens up an entire discussion piece. Because is it the being's capacity to relate or the other's capacity to enter into relationship with them? And I was thinking about it in reference to plants, right? So is it because plants can relate to us that therefore they are, and they are persons? But what about all the people who do not recognize this relationship and therefore do not enter into gosh, this is gonna make me think a lot. The concept of we-ness and a focus of interrelation rather than difference is an integral part of animist conceptions of personhood. Bird David stated that non-human persons are made by human beings through acts of relating, in which they are attentive to the behaviors of other beings. Put another way, other than humans are conferred moral status within a kinship relationship, genealogical or otherwise. Yeah, but what if the human refuses to relate? It still sounds like we're putting this very human-centric. In Nayaka culture, this relational epistemology model is very much immediate, being concerned with engaging particular beings, which particular Nayaka meet at a particular time and place. Nayaka are concerned with specific situations rather than universalisms. If the attentiveness to being collapses, so does the recognition of personhood. I don't know. This gives a lot of power to one side. Ancestors and attributes. As Harvey points out, animism is a hardworking word. It identifies a range of interesting phenomena, but also labels several distinct ways of understanding such matters. Another approach to personhood is through ancestral, genealogical, biological, myth-bound kinship relationships. Now, here we might be going somewhere. As notions of genealogical kinship have been influential on my understanding of plant personhood, I wish to outline such approaches here. Unfortunately, a full consideration would fill the whole monograph, so a few concise examples will have to suffice. Across a number of animistic indigenous cultures, shared kinship is genealogical in nature, with humans and other beings sharing common earthborn ancestry. Pointing out the nature of genealogy is such that individuals cannot appear in without thereby assuming relational ties to all other humans within the genealogy. The genealogical kinship between plants, animals, humans, rocks, etc., forms the basis of what Salmon calls concentric ecology, in which other than humans are brought into relationship of care and respect. In Aotearoa, Maori people tell a creation story that creates a genealogical kinship, wakapapa, between all earthly beings. In the mythological Maori homeland, Hawaiki, the sky father Ranginui, God, I'm butchering this, and the earth mother, Papatuanuka. We're going to go with that. I apologize to all the Maori. I'm trying my best. Were lovers locked in an age-long embrace, during which they had many children. The children of these initial Maori gods are the ancestors of all the beings in the world, including plants, rocks, seas, winds, animals, and human beings. All then share wakapapa from the earth mother and the father sky, from the god of the forest, whose actions created the earth, which is basically the Horus, Bastet, and Pan of the triad. Okay. So where are we going with this? All beings on earth. So this is one. So one idea is it's the relationship that creates the recognition of personhood. But I still don't understand that, because if a relationship means I have to relate and I refuse to relate, then I am taking away and denying personhood just because I choose not to relate. That just doesn't seem to make sense with me. Here it's the idea of genealogy. Because we all come from these gods and skies, then our kinship relationships are based in that. In the case of plants, for the great Maori weaver, that person, the flax is a descendant of the great god, this other god that we see here written. And today's Maori are related to harakiki and all other plants. Tane is their common ancestor. So it's genealogical. In neighboring Aboriginal Australia, there is a multiplicity of types of totems which are formed. Okay, I'm kind of skipping through this because they're kind of going through a lot of pieces of it. I want to get to the fact of how do they convey personhood. These beings are ancestral to all components of the natural world, and from them it is possible and indeed imperative to trace kinship among the others. So personhood comes from the fact that we are all kin, and that we are all kin. An example of such a story is that of Red Lily in the country of that word that I don't know how to pronounce, in the Daly River region of Northern Australia. And so this is, again, going into the idea that we have the plants share kinship with human beings based on this origin in the dreaming. And so it's just the fact that we share and we come from all the same ancestry. This is what makes it the fact that all of us have to have personhood. All have a right to exist. All have their own places of belonging. All have their own law and culture. And this is an interesting one, that all have their own law with a capital L. This is stating that we should not apply a universal law. I was just reading another article / paper about the idea of interconnected law. And this is an interesting area of study that I'm just starting to get into, is the idea. And because we've touched the rights of nature, the different kinds of law perspectives here before, that's the reason why I'm getting into this. But it's the idea that we are interconnected, and therefore our law cannot just be simply transactional, but needs to be thinking about the greater web of that is connected when there is a transaction between people. And I guess this is exactly the same thing. It's the idea of relational is not just the relationship between these two beings, but it's the idea that there are relational ability. There's relations that happen all across, and therefore I recognize personhoods based on this. And I guess if you expand it in that way, then the first theory around the idea that it's the recognition of the relationship could stand. But I like this. The genealogical one has its own challenges when you look at it from a broader concept that's not just indigenous based, but I do think that it takes us towards an understanding of it is, I guess the biggest question is that if we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, was beingness, I'm going to take away the word personhood for 1 second, although in this case, I'm kind of talking about the same thing. But is beingness something that was conveyed from the beginning, and therefore all derivatives, which is humans, are at the end of that derivative, are all of us then, that's what gave us the fact that we're all beings and therefore we're all persons? Or is it instead that we go kind of the scala naturae, where we go from inanimate object and we evolve into beingness? And I think that's really going to be that really is the tipping point for some. Indigenous cultures kind of look at the fact that everything started with being, because if you look at Father Sky and Mother Earth, then of course they're already animists, they're already being, they're already persons, and therefore everything that gets created from there is person. But if I think about evolution from the perspective of the Big Bang and these things, quote unquote, that slowly form and evolve over time, then it makes sense that it's only what are the ends of the chain that must be, and what they're doing is working their way backward, going, if this is what I consider to be a person, a being that is conveyed beingness and person, then I got to go back to find out what was the last common ancestor that had that. And this is where it doesn't make sense the way that it's being done. Even if you believe that, like, you know, okay, so chimpanzees have, and then bonobos, and then we go back, and it just becomes, I don't know, it becomes a conundrum. But I guess it really depends on what your origin story is in order for you to have an innate definition of personhood. Okay. In these kinship relationships, other than humans are recognized as having what has come to be known as some relational, but as beings who have their own lives, their own perspectives and ways of doing, at least in part. Sorry, let me just say this. In that same thing I was saying, if you believe that we have Father Sai and Mother Earth, and they had many, many children, and that's how everything got created. So your relation story has to do with animism and therefore beingness and personhood all the way around. I wonder if that makes it easier for us to understand that there might be different types of personhood. So they are persons, and then therefore enter into, and everything has personhood. But then does that make it easier or harder for us to believe that a plant has a type of personhood that's completely different from what Mother Earth had? And that rock person and winged person are two completely different things, and not just in the fact that one's a rock and one's a winged animal, but more like the way that their personhood expresses itself is completely different. Now I know why these people are all philosophers, by the way. All philosophers. It makes your brain hurt. It makes my mind hurt. My brain, no, actually makes my brain hurt after a while. There are known as relations, but as beings who have their own lives, their own perspectives and ways of doing things. At least in part, through these kinship relationships, they are known as persons. Therefore, distinct from Bird David's description of the Nayaka, in those cultures that have kinship systems that include other than humans, these help ground the situated specific relationships that include other than humans as persons. In many cultures, this transition of genealogy and ancestral knowledge through myths and stories helps people to learn about their kinship relationships with and the capacities of other than humans. In his work with the Ojibwa, Hallowell recognized that true stories, myths, reinforce the situated dialogical relationships that can be manifested in communication, both human and other human. And I can see that based on what I was just saying, right? It kind of gives us already the basis for the kinship, and then it makes it easier for us to open up the channels of understanding. Now we're not sort of asking if you're a person. I'm more asking, can you show me how you're a person? The conceptual reification of Flint, the winds and sun, and other human persons exemplifies a worldview in which natural-supernatural dichotomy has no place. And the representation of these beings in true stories reinforces the reality by means of a cultural device, which at the same time depicts their vital roles in interaction with other persons as integral forces in the functioning of unified cosmos. What then of the capacities of the other than human persons represented in such stories? In his treatment of a multiplicity of animisms, Graham Harvey asked some searching questions of how person-person encounters work and practice, and what they may tell us of the characteristics of other than human persons. In particular, Harvey asked, how does an animist know when to act in a ways proper to I-thou rather than I-it encounters? That is, when beings attentive to kinship-bound relationships, either situated, genealogical, or both, what signs of life and personhood might an animist adduce? These are powerful questions that bring us to attention at the core of the other than human personhood, and highlights the interplay between an interrelational stance, its attentiveness to the behaviors of non-humans, and the observed capacities of other than human persons. There is no definitive list of characteristics that entail personhood. So this goes through the idea that, remember how we were talking, how when they had asked in the, I can't remember what peoples, it was higher up, they asked, are all rocks persons? And they answered no. And the idea that personhood is not just conveyed because you're a rock, because you're a winged creature, because you're a human, but it is instead a series of characteristics that you personify, that you show, that you live out, and the relationships you create associated with that, which by this very bad definition implies that there could be humans that are not persons. And I have ideas of how that could look, but I have to think them through before I say them. But are there indications that give animists an idea that they are on the right track? Definitions of personhood relates that persons are volatile, relational, cultural, and social beings. They demonstrate agency and autonomy, and with varying degrees of autonomy and freedom. Persons are also recognized as living beings with their own perspective and with the ability to communicate in their own way. Plants. Persons display the commonalities of living beings, such as aging, disease, decay, and death. Persons also tend to be active with other accounts of general characteristics of personhood, including sentience, will, and even consciousness. Personhood is also associated with awareness, and persons have their own perspective. In this context, Aboriginal elder Bill, let's just call him Bill, succinctly described the awareness and perspective of plant persons in Gaguju country. Tree, he watching you. You look at tree, he listened to you. He got no finger, he can't speak, but that leaf, he pumping, growing in the night. An open relational stance of attentiveness to the behavior and characteristics of living beings, an emphasis on connection rather than separation, and recognition of retelling of genealogical kinship are all aspects of animistic approaches to personhood that have influenced and informed my understanding of plant personhood. They provide a strong counter to Marder's claim of animistic projection and naive veneration. Yes, they do. Marder, in this, you're starting to look very childish. So from personhood to flourishing. From this brief revisitation of animism, we turn to Marder's second related observation, that the problematic assumption that the concept of personhood can be extended to plants underpins Matthew Hall's recent book, Plants as Person, A Philosophical Botany. The exploration of animism above has helped lay the groundwork for a number of responses that I wish to make. The first is that the animist person category on which I draw is not archetypally human. So there is no need to extend it to other than human. The category includes all types of beings capable of relating, and subcategories of persons are acknowledged. Although attributes of personhood can be recognized and can inform behavior, unlike some animal rights theorists such as Peter Singer, these do not constitute a pre-agreed set of mental capacities that qualify a plant for personhood. As such, it is not and cannot be a concept that can be violently projected onto the natures of other than human beings. Personhood emerges from attentiveness to their nurturing. Personhood emerges from relationships of kinship and sharing. Personhood emerges from talking with the trees, not talking for them. That's quite lovely. But this goes back to my only discussion of, if you don't talk to the lichen, is the lichen not a person? I really do like this, and I like talking with a being and not talking for them. And I think that this is extremely important as plant communicators for us to remember. We need to talk with our plant partners, not for our plant partners, not as our plant partners, but with them. But I still have that nagging thing kind of in me. A second response is that the concept of plant personhood is far from problematic. It emerges from an attentive, inclusive approach to plant life that seeks to relate to human beings in the world, and in doing so recognizes a range of animistic characteristics, including life, communication, agency, autonomy, sentience, and volition. Such plant characteristics are increasingly supported by an ever-growing body of empirical observations in the plant sciences. This relational approach privileges and seeks to emphasize connection to beings in the face of morphology and physiology that are radically different from the human. In a world in which human societies have constructed and emphasized difference in order to justify domination, The ethics of connection is a powerful countervailing force. So true. So yeah, it is true. It is true. It pushes us towards this idea of relating. And it also puts in hand that we cannot categorically deny personhood to any being unless we have attempted to create relationship. Because if we don't attempt to create relationship, then it is unfair for us to just try to say that they're not. Another response is that although it might appear so from the title, the concept of personhood does not underpin my attempt to argue for the moral consideration of plants. In Plants as Persons, I do not argue that plants are contiguous with human beings, nor do I argue that plants display a predefined set of mental capacities that qualify them for personhood, or an archetypically extended human personhood. I clearly draw on the general principles of the relational personhood gleaned from new approach animist phenomenon outlined above. However, I use this inspiration in combination with other key concepts to challenge my own view of plant life and to construct my own approach to plant moral consideration. I do this in an attempt to avoid appropriating other knowledge systems and to ensure that my approach to moral consideration has currency in my Western concept. A brief summary of this approach must suffice. Okay, here's my problem. I actually have a hard stop that I have to go to a meeting, but we're so dang close. Okay, wait, hold on. Okay, no, we are super close. Sorry, I'm not. I'm gonna go through it. We're gonna do. All right, I might not comment as much stuff, but because we want to get through this and because it's just too good not to go through it. Against the backdrop of human hyper-separation from nature founded on the hierarchical ontological dualisms such as nature, culture, mind, matter, and the alterity of plants, their absolute otherness is manifest apparent. Halle characterizes plant forms as alien to human beings. So true, so true. Although few would contest the fact that plants have radical morphological differences with humans, I reject the approach of Halle as I reject the approach of Marder. But they are aliens. I'm going to get into that, but that's really an alien conversation. That better relationships will come through emphasizing and deepening our appreciation of otherness. Instead, I outline a philosophy that seeks affinity with plants and deliberately takes a relational inclusive stance, which emphasizes our connections. Inspired in part by those indigenous animist cultures, but also Jain and Buddhist traditions that have created relationships in the face of a clear and non-subsumable alterity of plants. On this basis, I seek to undercut the Aristotelian hierarchy of nature. Yes, which positions plants as passive beings. By outlining those capacities of plants, describing when humans, including indigenous animists, are attentive to their natures, including sentience, intelligence, agency, and volition, I support this by charting the ever-growing body of empirical observation in the plant sciences that are uncovering the intelligent volitional behavior of plants, which have since moved on to discussion of plant cognitions and sentience. In Calvo's paper, we have talked about. Equipped with an understanding of plant behavior, instead of trying to prove the existence of criteria, I base the recognition of plants as morally considerable as persons upon the ground of Kohak's philosophical ecology. In Kohak's view, manner of speaking are modes of interacting with reality, which render our world meaningful and guide our actions therein. The choices between these manners of speaking matter as they can lead to vastly different ends. In the context of contemporary ecological crisis, Kohak insists that we have a choice between treating trees as raw materials or treating them with respect. We have choice. The argument that underpins Plants as Person is based on the current evidence of their characteristics and abilities and their well-established genealogical kinship with human beings. It is more appropriate in our manner of speaking to accord plants moral status, to relate to them as persons, than to treat them as the inexhaustible supply of raw materials here only for human ends. Relating to plants as persons does not entail that we must eschew all use of plants in our daily lives. Exactly. We rely almost entirely on plants for our food, medicines, and shelter. It is not possible for human beings to live without killing at least some plants. Where some traditions have sought to deny or to minimize this violence, the recognition of plants as persons acknowledges this fact as earthly life. In doing so, it counters the real philosophical violence against plants, the banal violence outlined which involves denying their own lives and presence. Aho. Using the terms of Bakhtin, I characterize this as a monological stance. For Bakhtin, monologue does not recognize the voice or presence of the other. Monologue is finalized and deaf to the other's response, does not expect it, and does not acknowledge it of any decisive force. Monologue manages without the other. Monologue is modern science. In contrast to human-centered monologue, recognizing and relating to plants as persons opens up the possibility of a dialogue in which distinct voices and presences are heard and amplified. This dialogical attentiveness to their presence, to the lives and ways of plants in a world, is at the heart of my understanding of plant personhood. In the language of Bird David Kohak, this is talking with or speaking with plants. The lesson from animist cultures is that such a dialogue must be situated and embodied in care relationships with specific plants and plant communities. Therefore, allowing plant voices to be heard entails approaching plants with an openness and allowing plants to flourish. Working for the benefit of plants is therefore a direct way to build more dialogical human-plant relationships, which ultimately result in moral consideration and action. As Deborah Rose explains, a dialogical approach to connection impels one to work to realize the well-being of others. The path to connection, therefore, does not seek connection, but rather seeks to enable the flourishing of others. So beautiful, so beautiful. And I've talked recently in different things in the podcast and aspects of this concept of flourishing. We need to enable positive flourishing. I just sent out also a newsletter and posted about this. We need to enable this. So really recognizing plants as persons is almost moving towards positive psychology that helps us to better understand our place in the world and our relationships, and therefore allows not just the others to flourish, but also ourselves to flourish. We circle back then to the relational approach to personhood. It is relatively easy to argue philosophically for plants as persons, but much harder to enact and realize plant personhood in the context of worldly relationships, which is what I keep saying. This discussion is being kiboshed, is being blocked by so many because of the repercussions that we have to relook at all of our relationships with plants. And this is really the heart of the problem. We need to stop talking only about the science. We need to get into designing the new world. We need those new words. We need those new images. We need that shift of paradigm to help people see that we can have a world in which we recognize plants as persons and still use plants as necessary, but in a relational approach. One of the ways I suggest we do this, we do such working for the benefit of plants and toward plant flourishing, is through local ecological restoration, including actively and intentionally growing, giving back space, i.e. land, for wild plants communities to flourish. I reiterate that call here and do so in accordance with E.O. Wilson, who has argued that we need to set aside at least half of our planet for the other than human purposes. If you've never seen E.O. Wilson's half world, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's like a half world project. It's worth checking out. It's very interesting. In doing so, we must ensure that this does not lead to another hyper separation of human natures in the search for a pure wilderness in which plant communities must become removed from all human engagement and use. For relationships of care to be built, the priority must be for long-term restoration projects in the place of human habitation and with the history of human domination. Hundreds of such projects already exist, from large-scale landscape restoration of the Florida Everglades, Florida Everglades, to wetland restoration in former industrial sites. For those of us who carry out with us a Christian heritage that has traditionally denied personhood to plants, engaging with such projects carries the potential to take us from our position as the apex of the hierarchy of domination and move us towards the hierarchical position grounded in care and partnership, basically the reciprocal relationships that Robin Wall Kimmerer always talks about with the other than human world. In recognition of plants as persons emerges then not through the violent projection of human purposes and goals as Marder exists. It's not about me projecting my humanness onto a plant and veneration in that way, but instead, nor indeed in the pages of academic text, but from working with, relating to, and caring for a multitude of plants in collaborative projects of mutual benefit. Whoa, that was quite beautiful. That was quite beautiful. There's a lot to unpack there. There is a lot to unpack there. Wow. Wow. Okay. I unfortunately don't have the time right now to really recap this the way that I want, but when I post this, I will post the notes, I will post the link. I really do love the fact that he pushes into this idea of we need to create those relationships. And is that relationship that conveys personhood, and denying those relationships is denying another being the ability to flourish. I think that that's extremely powerful, and that our relationship should not be one of dominion, but instead one of reciprocal advantage, reciprocal exchange, which is again exactly what Robin Wall Kimmerer is always talking about. I love this paper. I am so happy that we went through it, and I am looking forward to hearing all your feedback. As soon as I post this up, I will post it in all the usual spaces. It will be here in the Naturally Conscious community for you to review, and then also eventually I'll publish it out into the other parts of the interweb for you to share with others if you think that they could be interested in this. Remember that live plant consciousness commentary happens every Friday right here. Please invite your friends to come if you think this is interesting. And if you've seen an article, a paper, a study, anything that you think would be interesting for me to cover in this context, please let me know. But until then, we'll see each other next week. And remember, always resist the urge to hold back your evolving green brilliance. This is me, Tigria Gardenia. I'm out. Bye.